Ladies and gentlemen, we need to have a very serious and very honest conversation about what is currently happening inside the Cleveland Browns quarterback room, because the developments coming out of that organization today touch on something that goes far beyond a routine roster decision or a standard training camp competition narrative, and they deserve to be examined with the kind of depth and directness that the stakes of this situation genuinely demand. Because what is being discussed right now in Cleveland circles, what Andrew Berry addressed on his podcast today and what Mary Kay Cabot reported through her coverage of this organization, connects directly to the long-term future of the most important player this franchise has acquired in years and to the question of whether Cleveland will demonstrate the organizational wisdom to protect that future or whether it will repeat patterns of behavior that have undermined promising situations before they could fully develop. Let us start with Dillon Gabriel, because his situation is the immediate practical matter that everything else in this conversation flows through, and because the parallels surrounding his current roster status are so obvious and so uncomfortable that the Cleveland Browns media apparatus has apparently decided the safest approach is to simply not acknowledge them publicly with the honesty they deserve. Andrew Berry went on a podcast today and spoke about the quarterback room, and one of the things he addressed was the decision surrounding Dillon Gabriel heading into training camp. According to reporting from Mary Kay Cabot, the Browns are keeping Dillon Gabriel after the draft and opting to let the quarterback competition play out during training camp rather than moving on from him through a trade or a release in the immediate aftermath of selecting Talon Green as an additional developmental quarterback option. Berry's position, as conveyed through his public comments, is that after watching the first few weeks of the offseason program, including the voluntary minicamp session in which Todd Monken got to see all three of his quarterbacks throw in 11-on-11 drills, the organization has decided to maintain Gabriel on the roster and evaluate how the competition between him and Talon Green for the third-string quarterback spot develops over the course of training camp. That is the official organizational position. That is the public-facing decision. And on the surface, it sounds reasonable enough that most people will absorb it without friction and move on to the next story. But here is what the Cleveland Browns media is conspicuously not saying out loud, what the comfortable and access-protective voices in that market are carefully avoiding because saying it requires a level of institutional honesty that creates friction with the organization they depend on for their access and their livelihood. The position that Dillon Gabriel currently occupies within the Cleveland Browns quarterback room is almost exactly the position that Shedeur Sanders occupied 1 year ago. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because the symmetry here is not subtle and it is not coincidental, and the fact that the same media environment that spent last year generating uncertainty and ambiguity around Sanders' situation is now being conspicuously quiet about Gabriel's parallel circumstances tells you everything you need to know about how driven by organizational relationships rather than honest journalism so much of the Cleveland Browns coverage actually is. Last year, Shedeur Sanders was the quarterback whose roster status was uncertain, whose future with the franchise was being discussed in terms of competition and evaluation, and let us see how things play out rather than in terms of clear and committed organizational direction. The media was not quiet about it then. The speculation was loud. The narrative was constant. The pressure on Sanders and on the organization to define his status was relentless and unforgiving. Every minicamp absence by another player became a storyline connected to the quarterback competition. Every practice rep distribution became fodder for analysis about what it meant for Sanders' standing within the building. And now Dillon Gabriel is in that same position, on the bubble, competing for a roster spot, being evaluated against...
Mary Kay, it seems like they have 10 guys already who can play offensive line for them this year.
Well, they do, and they do consider themselves offensive line snobs. It's an area that they're going to continue to add bodies to and add talent to, and I think they did a remarkable job of completely overhauling that line in one offseason. I mean, that's not easy to do, but they did it with trades, they did it with free agency, they did it with the draft, and voila, it's done.
What's the expectation now for next year? You got to believe that if I'm ownership, I want more than 5 wins going into next season. I just don't know. I still think we all ask ourselves, who is the quarterback? So what's the expectation going into next year after this draft?
A newly drafted developmental quarterback for a role that may not exist for him after training camp, and the media is quiet. The big outlets are not pressing the story with the same urgency they applied to Sanders' situation. The commentary is measured and careful and designed not to create waves that might disturb comfortable relationships with the organization. That double standard is worth naming directly, and it is worth holding up to the light so that Cleveland Browns fans can see it clearly and understand how it has shaped the information environment they have been navigating throughout this entire process. Now let us get to the part of this conversation that carries the most weight and the most urgency, because the Dillon Gabriel situation is ultimately a secondary matter compared to the primary concern that deserves the most honest and most careful examination available. What happens next year at the quarterback position in Cleveland? This question is not premature. This question is not speculative in the irresponsible sense of manufacturing controversy where none exists. This question is the direct and logical consequence of everything that has happened during this offseason, from the ownership-driven decision to draft Tellone Green despite signals from the coaching staff that it did not originate from their offensive construction vision, to the retention of Dillon Gabriel against what appeared to be the coaching staff's preference to move on from him, to the broader pattern of Jimmy Haslam's demonstrated history of wanting to draft quarterbacks every single year. Regardless of whether the organizational situation actually calls for it. If the Cleveland Browns go into next year's draft and select a first-round quarterback, the implications for Shedeur Sanders are severe and potentially franchise-altering in ways that this organization cannot afford to treat casually or dismiss as hypothetical. Consider the position that would put Sanders in. He would have spent his first full season as the Cleveland Browns starting quarterback, operating within Todd Monken's system, building chemistry with the offensive weapons assembled around him during this draft, developing the kind of in-game experience and situational intelligence that only comes from taking actual NFL snaps in competitive regular season environments. He would have done all of that work. Put in all of that effort. Invested everything required to establish himself as the franchise quarterback this organization told him, told the league, and told its fan base that it believed him to be. And then the organization would walk into the draft and use a first-round pick on another quarterback. Think about what message that sends. Not the message that the organization will carefully word in its public statements, but the actual message that Shedeur Sanders would receive as a professional and as a competitor who has poured himself into proving that he deserves the full and unconditional commitment of the franchise that drafted him. The message is that regardless of what you did this season, regardless of how you performed and how you developed and how you led this offense through whatever challenges the 2026 season presented, we are still not certain enough about you to stop drafting your potential replacements. That message, delivered through the action of a first-round quarterback pick, would almost certainly accelerate a very specific and very understandable response from Sanders himself. Why would he stay? That is the question stated in its simplest and most honest form. Why would Shedeur Sanders remain with an organization that has demonstrated through the most expensive and most permanent kind of roster decision available to it that it does not fully and finally believe he is the answer? Why would any competitive, talented, self-aware professional quarterback choose to continue operating in an environment where the organization keeps introducing new competitors for his position rather than surrounding him with the supporting cast and the organizational clarity that allows him to grow and succeed and win? The analogy that applies here is one that every working professional can understand regardless of their familiarity with NFL roster construction. Imagine dedicating yourself completely to a job. Showing up every day with full effort and full commitment. Doing everything your employer asks of you and doing it at a high level. Taking every responsibility assigned to you seriously and executing it with care and professionalism. And then watching your employer hire another person for your exact role, not as a stated replacement, not with any honest acknowledgement that your performance has been inadequate, but as another layer of so-called competition that the organization insists is just standard practice while never actually giving you the promotion and the title and the official recognition that your performance has earned. At some point, a person with options leaves. At some point, a person with genuine competitive value and genuine professional pride decides that the energy required to fight for clarity in an environment that refuses to provide it is better invested somewhere else, somewhere that will name them the starter, commit to their development, and build around their strengths without the constant background noise of manufactured competition and organizational ambiguity. Shedeur Sanders has options. He will have more options after a full NFL season, especially if he performs at the level that his minicamp showing and his overall talent profile suggest he is capable of reaching. And if Cleveland goes back into the draft next year and invests first-round capital in another quarterback, the probability that Sanders explores those options becomes very high and very real. This organization cannot afford that outcome. Not after everything invested in building the offensive infrastructure around him during this draft. Not after Spencer Fano was selected at number 9 specifically to protect his blind side. Not after
Expectation is to win more than 5 games, and I actually think that if they do get some good quarterback play, and that's so vitally important, of course, that brings the whole thing together, that they can make some noise in the AFC North. But you've got to get good quarterback play, and I can't honestly say yet that I know how that's going to go or how that's going to turn out. So we'll have to see. If they have all the weapons that they need. The only thing I think they don't have right now is certainty at quarterback. And once they get a clearer picture of that, it will be easier to say, yep, I think this is a 8-win team, 9-win team, maybe they can go 10.
I think you're right on the money with the uncertainty at quarterback still. Do you see any, and I'm not sure there is because of what they did in the draft, anything that you can see coming around, the June moves that sometimes happen, where Andrew Berry is going to have his radar up and working to bring something else to this team?
Well, Andrew is still in the acquisition season, and he considers this to be continuing on through probably, until the trade deadline. I mean, nothing is off the table until they get through the trade deadline. So certainly anything can still happen, and he's very aggressive, and we know he loves to make deals. So, some of it can be dictated by injuries if something happens. You never really know. If they have to pivot at some point, they will. Right now, I don't envision anything huge coming down the pike, but he will be opportunistic as always.
I know a lot of people just want to talk about offense because that's what they did the majority of the draft. How do you think the defense feels now? You brought in 2 guys. I expect them to start, but I don't know, a second rounder, E-Man. I don't know. It may be where he might fall into things after camp, but a lot of talk has been about the offense. How do you feel about the defense after the draft?
Well, I do think that E-Man will. I do think that he will be part of the safety rotation. They will play a lot of 3 safety looks, so he's going to be a key part of that. So that'll be a really nice addition for them. I still think that they're probably going to try to look for maybe another third edge rusher. They could use somebody else over there. AJ Epineza didn't work out, who they tried to sign in free agency. So that's one area that they can probably still add to the pile a little bit. But for the most part, I think they feel pretty set on defense. They know that Carson and Mason are going to take a step up in their second year. So there will be improvement just by virtue of that. But overall, I think they feel pretty good about the defense.
Casey Consumption and Denzel Boston and Joe Royer were all added as weapons designed to support his development and his production. Not after the entire draft class was constructed with his success as the organizing principle around which every decision was made. Losing Sanders after all of that investment because the organization could not summon the organizational discipline to stop drafting quarterbacks every single year would represent a catastrophic failure of organizational wisdom that no amount of future drafting success could easily repair. The Kenny Pickett parallel is worth invoking here because it is directly relevant to how Cleveland has handled similar situations before. Pickett's roster status was a topic of discussion and uncertainty for an extended period before the organization ultimately moved on from him. The pattern of generating and then managing and then eventually resolving quarterback uncertainty through action rather than through clear and committed communication has repeated itself in Cleveland more than once, and the cost of that pattern in terms of wasted developmental time and eroded organizational trust is significant even when the individual outcomes have eventually been managed reasonably well. The difference with Sanders is that the stakes are exponentially higher. This is not a developmental backup whose departure would be noted and then absorbed without lasting organizational consequence. This is the player around whom an entire draft class was constructed, around whom a complete offensive infrastructure was assembled, and around whom the coaching staff's entire developmental vision for the 2026 season and beyond has been organized. Losing him to organizational indecision and ownership-driven quarterback drafting habits would set this franchise back in ways that would take years to recover from, and that the fanbase, which has already demonstrated enormous patience with rebuilding cycles that have taken longer than promised, would have genuine and legitimate reason to find completely unacceptable. Todd Monken needs to be empowered to make this right. Andrew Berry needs to be empowered to make this right. And Jimmy Haslam needs to look honestly at the pattern of behavior around the quarterback position that has characterized his ownership tenure and make a deliberate and permanent decision to trust the people he hired to build this team and to commit to the quarterback those people have identified, developed, and invested in with the full force of this organization's draft capital and roster construction philosophy. Training camp is coming. The 2026 season is coming. And between now and next year's draft, Cleveland will have the opportunity to watch Shedeur Sanders do what he has been preparing to do and build the kind of track record that makes the question of organizational commitment simple and obvious rather than complicated and ambiguous. The hope is that when that moment arrives, when the draft board comes out next year and the temptation to add another quarterback resurfaces as it apparently always does with this ownership group, the people running this franchise will look at what Sanders has built and what the team has built around him and choose the path that protects and honors that investment rather than undermining it. Because the alternative is losing the player who is supposed to be the answer to the most important question in Cleveland Browns football. And this fan base, this city, and this franchise cannot afford to get that wrong again. The quarterback room situation is worth watching closely. Dylan Gabriel's training camp competition with Talon Green will resolve itself through performance. But the larger question, the one that actually matters for the long-term direction of this franchise, is whether Cleveland has finally learned the lesson that committing to a quarterback means committing fully and permanently, not just until the next draft class makes the temptation of another option feel irresistible. Shedeur Sanders deserves that commitment. He has earned it. And everything the Cleveland Browns have built around him this offseason will either mean something lasting or mean nothing at all, depending on whether that commitment holds. The clock is running. And this time, Cleveland cannot afford to look away from it.